In the early hours of the morning, an armed man in a mask walks up to an elderly woman's front door. Before he does anything else, he reaches up and disables the security camera watching the porch. He doesn't search for it. He knows it's there, which means he has been to this house before. That woman is 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie. By sunrise, she is gone from her home outside Tucson, Arizona. Within days, messages begin arriving at local newsrooms, addressed by name to her daughter, one of the most recognizable journalists in the country. Whoever wrote them describes details only a person who had been inside the house could know. One of those messages ends with 3 words: "We are truly sorry." Sorry for what? That is the part investigators decided the public wasn't allowed to know. The contents of that message stayed sealed for 4 months. When they finally surfaced in June, they raised a bigger question than the one they answered, because some of the most experienced investigators in the country don't believe a word of it. Tonight, we're laying out what actually happened, what the evidence shows, what that hidden message said, why it was kept quiet, and why the people who read cases like this for a living can't agree on whether it's a confession or a hoax. A quick note before we start. This is an active, unresolved case involving the abduction of an elderly woman, and parts of it are difficult. I'll keep the focus on the facts and the investigation rather than the worst details. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let me know in the comments which town or country you're watching from. To everyone who's been here liking, sharing, and commenting on these cases, thank you. Your support is what grows this channel and keeps stories like this one in front of people who might actually know something. Here is the last confirmed timeline of Nancy Guthrie's movements. On Saturday, January 31st, 2026, she had dinner at her daughter Annie's home, arriving at 5:32 in the evening. Afterward, her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, drove her home and dropped her off around 9:48 p.m. He waited until she was inside before leaving. That detail matters, because in any case like this, suspicion lands first on the people closest to the victim. Here it didn't stick. The Pima County Sheriff's Office cleared the family of involvement early, and the investigation turned toward an outside intruder. The next morning, February 1st, Nancy didn't appear for her church's Sunday live stream, something she did every week without exception. That absence set off the alarm. When people checked on her, she was gone, and she was reported missing that day. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos said the evidence pointed to one conclusion: she had been removed from her home against her will. Forensic testing later confirmed that bloodstains found inside the house were hers. This was not a woman who had wandered off. To understand why investigators ruled that out so quickly, you have to understand who Nancy Guthrie was. She was born Nancy Long on January 27, 1942. She married Charles Guthrie, and in 1988 he died at 49 during a mining exploration trip in Mexico, leaving her a widow with 3 children to raise on her own: Cameron, Annie, and Savannah. She raised them in the Southwest, and the family's roots in Tucson run deep. Savannah herself began her broadcasting career at a station in that same city, years before she reached network television. Her family has pushed back on the shorthand the headlines reached for, the famous anchor's elderly mother, because that label erases the woman who actually lived that life. At 84, Nancy lived alone in the Catalina foothills by choice. She had a heart condition that required daily medication and a pacemaker, and her mobility was limited. But her family has been firm on one point, and it shapes the entire case. She was mentally sharp and fully independent. She kept her own schedule, ran her own household, stayed active in her community, and attended church regularly. That rules out the easy assumption that an elderly woman simply got confused and walked off into the desert. Her routine was steady enough that a single missed Sunday was treated as an emergency within hours. When her family later described the danger she was in, they emphasized that she relied on medication she didn't have with her and could not safely go without. The clearest piece of physical evidence is the doorbell footage. On February 10th, the FBI, under Director Kash Patel, released stills and a short clip showing an armed individual in a mask, carrying a backpack, tampering with the camera at Nancy's home around the time she disappeared. The Bureau identified him as a suspect. He has never been publicly identified, and the mask means there is no face to circulate and no obvious way to match him to a name. What investigators drew from that footage was not only who, but how. A retired Pima County lieutenant who knows the terrain explained that the desert washes around the foothills, the dry channels that cut between properties, make natural low-visibility routes in and out, and that there are indications someone may have scouted the area in advance. Put the pieces together. Disabling a camera he already knew about, arriving armed and equipped, choosing a night Nancy was home alone, and likely planning an exit through the washes. Investigators read that as a deliberate operation, not a crime of opportunity. And that is exactly what makes the case so hard to solve. Because a deliberate operation usually has a clear motive behind it, and here there isn't one. Authorities have said publicly that they believe Nancy was taken against her will, but they have not determined why. Consider the statistical backdrop. According to FBI data covering roughly the year around her disappearance, the large majority of abduction victims are adults between 20 and 39, and nearly half of all abductions occur between current or former romantic partners. A planned abduction of an 84-year-old woman, apparently by a stranger, with no obvious financial, personal, or domestic motive on the surface, falls outside almost every pattern investigators rely on. When the usual motive categories don't fit, the usual shortcuts to a suspect don't either. The footage pulls investigators in two directions at once. The planning points towards someone with local knowledge, someone who understood the layout of the property, knew where the camera was, and could find his way through the washes in the dark. That suggests a degree of familiarity. Yet there is no identification, no clear personal connection, and a victim who fits none of the common profiles. So the crime looks personal in its preparation and impersonal in its motive. And reconciling those two facts has been one of the central problems of the entire investigation. The response matched the seriousness of the case. The Pima County Sheriff's Department led the investigation alongside the FBI's Phoenix Division, which runs a large office in Tucson, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection joined because of how close the city sits to the Mexican border. On February 5th, the FBI released a missing person image, and the sheriff held a press conference, and it was around this point that the family was publicly cleared. The president posted that he was directing federal resources to the search. The sheriff said he had more than 400 officers working it. Investigators canvassed homes and businesses across the neighborhood, and asked anyone within a 2-mile radius to turn over surveillance video from as far back as January 1st through February 2nd. Anything that struck them as out of the ordinary. One official described the volume as thousands of hours of footage, much of it reviewed frame by frame, slowed down to catch a single passing vehicle or figure. Agents briefed U.S. Border Patrol and Mexican authorities to watch for anything connected to the case. The story drew international attention, and a memorial of flowers and handwritten signs grew at the edge of Nancy's property, one of them reading that her neighbors stood with the family. Before we get to the message at the center of this case, you need one piece of context, because it changes how you read everything that follows. After Nancy disappeared, a large number of notes and emails came in claiming knowledge of her whereabouts. Most of them, by the family's own account, were not considered real. Out of all of them, investigators treated only 2 as credible enough to act on, and those 2 are the ones this story turns on. The first arrived on February 2nd, one day after Nancy was reported missing. It came through the online tip lines of 3 outlets, 2 Tucson stations and TMZ, and it was addressed directly to Savannah Guthrie. It demanded a ransom in cryptocurrency, later reported as $6 million in Bitcoin, with a deadline of 5 p.m. on February 9th. A CBS affiliate in Tucson confirmed it had received a letter demanding payment, reviewed it, and shared it with the FBI,
and the Bureau said early on that it was taking 2 emailed messages seriously, including that apparent ransom demand. What made this note credible was the specificity. It referenced things that had not been made public: an Apple Watch with a white band on the floor of Nancy's bedroom, and a broken light on her back porch. Those are details you only have if you've been inside the house or spoken to someone who was. The family responded directly. In video appeals on February 4th and 7th, Savannah and her siblings addressed whoever had their mother. They asked for proof she was alive, pointing out that images and voices can be faked, and that they needed to know without a doubt she was still alive. They described her fragile health and her need for medication, and they said plainly that they would pay. Then the deadline came and went on February 9th, with no verified proof of life and no recovery. The second credible note arrived on February 6th. It was written in the same language and style as the first, and investigators came to believe both came from the same source, likely sent from the same IP address. But the second note was different in one decisive way. It made no demand at all.
No ransom, no deadline, no instructions. Instead, it claimed Nancy had already died, that she had passed shortly after she was taken, that she was buried in nature, and that those responsible never intended for her to die. It closed with the apology from the start of this video. After it arrived, the family recorded another message saying they had received it and understood, and pleaded for their mother to be returned. Law enforcement made a deliberate decision about that second note. They asked that its contents stay private, and publicly, the death claim was withheld. For 4 months, people following this case had no idea the message existed. We'll come back to that decision, and to whether the note is even real. First, what investigators did with everything else they had, because the technical effort here was unusually aggressive. Nancy's pacemaker became one of the more unusual leads. Because the device transmits a Bluetooth signal, the federal government brought in specialized equipment to try to detect it and pinpoint her location. It was always a long shot. Bluetooth has a short range, and the device would need to be powered and close to a receiver to register at all. The equipment picked up nothing. Investigators examined the septic tank on her property, removed a camera from the roof of the house, and towed a vehicle from her garage for analysis. Google was brought in to attempt to recover additional footage from the home's cameras. The forensic work was the backbone of it. DNA recovered inside the house, including hair samples, was sent for analysis using enhanced techniques, the kind of advanced testing used to build a profile of an unknown person from trace material. Reporting indicates a Northern California forensics lab, the same type credited with helping break the Gilgo Beach serial killer case, was involved. Cadaver dogs were used at some points and held back at others. Search teams worked the desert washes the suspect may have used to move, and that effort continued into the spring, with retired investigators still walking the channels months later and pointing out how easily something could be concealed beneath the brush. When the public asked for updates, the sheriff's office summarized it plainly. An active investigation centered on evidence analysis, including DNA and digital evidence, with no further specifics released. That phrase, digital evidence, carries a lot of weight here. It covers the ransom note's email headers and metadata, the IP address investigators believe links the 2 credible notes, and the cryptocurrency wallet tied to the $6 million demand. Each of those is a potential thread, and each is also built to resist being pulled. Anonymized email and crypto transactions can be routed to obscure where they came from, and tracing them often takes months of subpoenas and cross-agency cooperation. The DNA side points toward forensic genetic genealogy, the method that builds a family tree from a trace sample to identify someone who isn't already in a criminal database.
It is powerful, but it isn't fast. It needs a usable profile. It depends on relatives turning up in genealogy databases, and it can take many months to produce a name. None of these tools failed, exactly. They just haven't closed the gap yet. Several moments looked like breakthroughs, and weren't. On February 10th, a person of interest was detained after a traffic stop in Rio Rico, about 60 miles south of Tucson. Investigators executed search warrants on a property and a vehicle, then released him the next day after determining he had no involvement. On February 13th, the department ran an operation at a home roughly 2 miles from Nancy's, removing 2 people and closing nearby roads for several hours. That lead also went nowhere. The search pushed across the border as well. TMZ reported receiving later messages, including one claiming Nancy had been taken into Mexico and demanding a single Bitcoin in exchange for information, and the FBI looked into those too. An anonymous tip to a nonprofit about a possible grave near Nogales prompted 3 separate searches in that area. None of them found her. A high-profile case generates its own friction, and this one did. Volunteer groups offered to help search. Social media attention grew heavy enough that the sheriff's department increased patrols in Nancy's neighborhood after residents complained about influencers walking onto private property. And as the weeks stacked up without an arrest, scrutiny landed on the investigation itself. The Pima County Board of Supervisors voted to question Sheriff Nanos about his management of the department, and his office defended his handling of the case. Public news conferences stopped. By spring, the media crews that had filled the foothills in February had largely cleared out, even as neighbors kept asking how a case with this much technology and manpower behind it had produced no answers. It's tempting to assume that a case with this profile cannot simply go cold. Tucson's own history says otherwise. The same county has families who have waited years. As much constitutes, but they don't guarantee a resolution, and every week without one makes the next harder. It's worth pausing on a contradiction the investigators themselves had to weigh, because it sits at the heart of the doubt.
The first note ran like textbook extortion. Anonymous, crypto-based, hard to trace, a large demand backed by a hard deadline. The second, 4 days later, abandoned the money entirely and offered an apology. People who carry out a calculated abduction and demand $6 million do not typically follow up with condolences. That shift is either a sign that something went wrong and the plan collapsed, or a sign that whoever was writing was never really negotiating in the first place. By late June, with no arrest and the leads cooling, the second note's contents finally became public. On June 22nd, news outlets reported what it said. The obvious question was, why now, after 4 months of silence? The explanation from former federal investigators is practical rather than dramatic. Releasing a detail like that early, while there was still any chance of communicating with whoever took Nancy, and while the digital evidence was fresh, could have wrecked the investigation's best leads and signaled to the sender that the message had landed. Months in, with the suspect gone quiet and the digital trail stalled, the calculation changes. A high-profile detail can put a stalled case back in the news and shake loose tips that had dried up as the public moved on. One retired agent also noted that the FBI's Victim Services Unit stays in close contact with families, so the release almost certainly came as no surprise to the Guthries. In short, the timing was a tool, held in reserve until the case needed it. That is genuinely worth debating, and I want your take. Was 4 months of public silence the right call, protecting the investigation and any slim chance of recovery? Or did the case lose momentum it can't get back, while the family waited longer than it had to? There's a real argument on both sides. Tell me where you land in the comments. The harder debate is whether the notes are authentic at all. The family believes they are. Savannah has said she considers the 2 notes they received and responded to genuine, and reporting indicates authorities ultimately authenticated them. For much of the investigation, though, officials were publicly non-committal, neither confirming nor denying the validity of any of the notes, even as they treated 2 of them seriously. The strongest point in favor of authenticity is the inside knowledge in the first note, the watch, the broken porch light. That is difficult to fake. But experienced investigators have pushed back, and their reasoning is specific. And a retired FBI agent has said he's skeptical, noting that genuine remorse is rare in this kind of crime, and that anyone who truly knew where Nancy was could simply say so, instead of writing "buried in nature," a phrase that gives searchers nothing to act on. A criminal profiler went further, saying the 2 notes read to him as if they were written by 2 different people. Layer that on top of the fact that most of the notes in this case were judged fake, and the doubt carries weight. So the case splits into 2 clean possibilities. Either this is a confession from someone who was present, or it's manipulation by someone who was never there, but had access to scene details that leaked. Which version you find more convincing probably comes down to how much weight you put on that inside knowledge. But I'd like to hear your read. There is also a quieter cost to all of this that's easy to miss. Savannah Guthrie reports the news for a living, and for months, she has been at the center of one of the biggest stories in the country, about her own mother. When she returned to Today in April, producers reportedly put procedures in place for exactly this situation. If news on the case breaks during the broadcast, she is kept away from the set while another anchor handles it on air, so that she doesn't learn a development about her mother live, in front of millions of people. That detail says more about the strain on this family than any dramatic line could. Here is where things stand. As of late June 2026, nearly 5 months after she disappeared, Nancy Guthrie has not been found, and no one has been arrested or charged. There has been no suspect named publicly, no trial, no resolution. The figure from the doorbell camera remains unidentified. A combined FBI and Pima County task force is still working the case. The Guthrie family is offering a $1 million reward. The FBI is offering up to $100,000 more. And earlier in the search, the family also pledged $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. If there's one thing investigators say again and again about cases like this, it's that the break rarely comes from a lab. It comes from a person. Someone who noticed a friend change after the 1st of February, money that appeared from nowhere, a trip that didn't make sense, an offhand comment that didn't sit right at the time. That is why the reward exists, and why the family keeps making the same plea in public. In her first interview about the case, Savannah acknowledged how little the family actually knew, and appealed directly to anyone holding back, saying it is never too late to do the right thing. When the note's contents surfaced in June, she addressed it on air only briefly, saying she couldn't pretend she wasn't there, and repeated one message: somebody knows something. That is the right place to end, because once you set the speculation aside, the case is straightforward and unresolved. An independent, clear-minded woman was taken from her own home by someone who had planned it. 2 credible notes followed, one demanding money and one claiming she was already gone, and investigators still cannot say with certainty who sent them or where Nancy is. What that summary leaves out is the person at the center of it. Nancy Guthrie raised 3 children alone after losing her husband young, ran her own life well into her 80s, and showed up for the things she cared about every single week. Her family is still waiting for an answer, and they have made clear they intend to keep asking for one. If you know anything, a name, a rumor, a detail that didn't add up around the 1st of February, there are people who need to hear it. You can contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI, that's 1-800-225-5324, or Tucson's 88 Crime Line at 520-882-7463. You can stay anonymous, and the reward is real. And if this is the first you're hearing of Nancy Guthrie's case, share it. Cases like this move when enough people are paying attention, and the more who know her name, the harder it becomes for what happened to stay hidden. Leave your read on those notes below, subscribe to follow where this goes next, and I'll see you in the next one.